People who witnessed a murder, what is your scariest story? Story 1. Was walking home one day and saw a couple arguing. The man started walking away from the girlfriend's car, and apparently she was not happy about that. She got into her car and waited about 5 minutes until he was far down the sidewalk. I was walking on the opposite side of the road from him when all of a sudden I saw a blur and he went flying like a rocket. She must have been going at least 60 miles per hour. He flew through the air, hit a tree, and died instantly. The woman then screamed out the window at his body and drove away. There was blood smeared all over the crumpled hood, and I will never forget the sight of his contorted body at the base of the tree, almost folded in half. I had to talk to the police, and within the hour they caught her at a car wash trying to clean the blood and pieces off the hood and grill of her car. I was 16 at the time. For those of you concerned, thank you. I did have to see a therapist for a few months after, and I am doing very well right now. However, I do not think I will ever fully get over it. It is one of those things that always sticks with you. Story 2, I was 16, riding in the passenger seat of my mother's car, driving down the highway at about 3:30 in the afternoon. Traffic came to a complete halt, and we were in the right-hand lane. As we were creeping along, a semi-truck appeared on the shoulder of the highway, with the door swung wide open. As we moved past, there was a trail of blood down the doorstep onto the concrete and then leading about 20 feet further down the road. As we crept forward, the trail of blood ended with a man lying face up, completely covered in blood. There were no police officers or ambulances there yet. This was on a highway in the suburbs of a major metropolitan area in the United States, so plenty of people saw it before the scene was taken over by emergency services. It turned out the truck driver had a partner with him. They got into an argument, and the passenger stabbed the driver around a dozen times and then escaped. The murderer was caught about an hour and a half away. One stayed over 2 days later. I have to imagine I was about 5 minutes behind the truck pulling over, because the police can be in that spot in about 30 seconds. Being in the passenger seat in the right lane of the highway, I was about 10 feet from the body. It is a haunting image. Story 3, I was in the military, and we were at training camp doing rappel training. We had a recruit who was 18 years old and next in line. He kept saying things like that his equipment was malfunctioning and that he needed help with his equipment. Of course, the drill sergeant thought he was just being an incompetent recruit. After saying a bunch of cruel and mocking things to the kid that made everyone uncomfortable, he told him he had 3 seconds to rappel and started counting. At that point, you could see the fear in the kid's eyes, and we started to realize he was being very serious. When the drill sergeant finished counting, he put his hand on the recruit's chest, pushed him, and the kid fell 60 feet straight backward, landing flat on his back. The sound that came out of him when he hit the ground, the gurgling, all of it, I will never forget. Later, I was in the first sergeant's waiting room, and our captain was in the office with him. I could overhear the phone conversation with the parents, where they assured them they did everything they could, but the recruit did not ensure his equipment was properly secured and suffered a malfunction due to his oversight, and that he was in the hospital in critical condition. He died before the end of the night. 2 years later, multiple high-ranking military personnel and non-commissioned officers were investigated for similar incidents at that facility. However, I do not know if that instructor ever got into any trouble or if the family ever received any closure. Later, people accused me of making the story up because of wording and terminology, sent hateful messages, and dismissed the experience entirely. I reported and blocked those messages not for attention, but because the issues had already been addressed many times, and I chose not to engage with people who were only interested in attacking rather than understanding what happened. Story 4. My brother, who was 18 at the time, and his 18-year-old wife lived next door to a family with a teenage son. She started an affair with that 17-year-old boy. One day, the boy barged into my brother's place and started attacking him. I do not know exactly why, but the wife did not seem to want to move away with my brother when he was leaving for the army. My brother was packing and moving because he was leaving, and he had pulled down a metal pole from a closet to make room for boxes. He grabbed that pole and used it to fight off the teenager, who ran out bleeding. My brother called my father, who lived a few blocks down the street, and my father immediately jumped into action. He grabbed one of his hunting shotguns and some birdshot ammunition and ran out the door to the car, yelling for us to call 911. My mother and I ran after him because we were confused and wanted to see where he was going, and my mother was on the phone with the police while they dispatched the only officer our town had. We ran down the road toward my brother's place because we saw my father pull in, and as we got closer, we heard a gunshot and saw my father and brother taking cover behind the open car doors. Another shot went off, and we could tell it was not my father firing. The teenager had run back home next door, bleeding, and told his father that my brother was trying to kill him. His father grabbed his handgun, saw my father and brother leaving, and started shooting, which is the gunfire my mother and I heard. Not understanding the danger, we kept running toward my father's car, and I saw my father position his shotgun in the car window and fire one round. He and my brother then got into the car and drove back toward us and home. When we were all together again, my father told us he had shot the man in the stomach. Chaos broke out on our street with ambulances, police, and neighbors everywhere. The other father was taken to the hospital, and my father was taken into custody. Within hours, we learned that the man had died because the birdshot hit his liver and he bled out. And it turned out he was an alcoholic whose liver could not survive the trauma. My father was charged with murder, and we began receiving death threats. Under the cover of night, we were moved and hid for days until my father was released on bond, and eventually we moved far away. A grand jury was convened, and I had to testify to what I saw. After all the evidence and testimony were presented, my father was not charged because the grand jury ruled it was self-defense. We never talk about what happened, and life carried on as normal, but that day is forever burned into my memory. My father never recovered from taking a man's life, even though it was not intentional, and he later became addicted to heroin after faith alone could not save him. We lost him to his demons in 2008. My brother has done well for himself but still fights his own battles every day. I am neither for nor against guns. I just wish this had never happened because so many lives were changed. And my brother divorced his wife after he left for the army, and she has been gone from our lives forever. Story 5. I was riding my bike to work when I witnessed the attack, and I was the first person to approach, fully convinced the woman was going to die. I heard the truck before I looked, and I watched as she was run over completely, with both sets of tires passing over her. It was and still is the most horrible thing I have ever witnessed. I was about 100 to 150 feet away, and as soon as the truck pulled off, I had an internal argument with myself about approaching because I did not want to see a mangled body up close. But if there was any chance she was still alive, I did not want her to be alone. It was only a few seconds, but it felt like forever before I went over to her. She was alive and conscious, and I tried to comfort her while calling 911, but she only spoke Spanish, so I could not really communicate with her. Another woman who had seen everything came running over from across the street and was able to speak with her in Spanish while I stayed on the phone with emergency services. I believe she helped contact the woman's family because none of us were sure she would survive. The ambulance arrived quickly and stabilized her, and after she was taken away, I went to work and tried not to think about it. I actively avoided learning anything about what happened afterward because not knowing whether she lived allowed me to believe she was okay, and I did not want to know if she had died. This experience later pushed me to finally look it up, and for the first time I learned that she survived, which brought me relief and hope that she is doing well. Seeing someone try to kill another person changes you, and while I do not think about that day every day, it still haunts me. Story 6. I was working in the off-campus residences at my university during the Christmas break, when most students had gone home, and I was there keeping an eye on the place. I was in my small office inside one of the apartment buildings when I heard a series of popping sounds that honestly reminded me of small fireworks going off in the stairwell. I looked out my office window, which was just outside the bottom of the stairwell and facing south, to see what was happening. As I watched, 3 or 4 men came running down the stairs and took off toward the east, heading for the complex entrance. And about 10 seconds later, another man came down the stairs and slowly walked toward the southwest. I went outside to check for any damage and headed up the stairwell. But when I reached the top, there was no debris, smoke, or anything else. just a cell phone on the ground and a single small hole in the wall outside one of the apartment doors. At the other end of the corridor was another stairwell, and at the bottom of it sat an old car, idling with its headlights on and several doors hanging open. Something felt very wrong, and although I wondered if those sounds had been gunshots, there was no smell of gunpowder or visible blood, just that small hole. To be safe, I called the police, who said they were sending officers immediately. And because the station was very close, they arrived in less than a minute. I gave them a summary of what I had seen, and they split up to search in the directions the men had gone. Less than 30 seconds later, they found the lone man who had walked toward the southwest, and it turned out he had been shot multiple times and had managed to cross the parking area and collapse behind a building. They attempted resuscitation, but when the ambulance arrived, the paramedics pronounced him dead at the scene. The officers who went east found the other men and made arrests. I later had to testify in court during the trial of the man believed to be the shooter, where I simply explained what I witnessed, as I did not know any of the people involved or see faces clearly. From what I later heard, it was a substance deal gone wrong, with two gangs from different counties choosing the apartments because they assumed they would be empty during the holidays, and one side tried to rob the other, resulting in the shooting, and as far as I know, the shooter was sentenced to prison. Story 7, I was at the grand opening of a sports bar the night Manny Pacquiao fought Chris Algieri. The bar was packed beyond belief, so crowded that you could not get back to your table without squeezing through other patrons and trying not to put your body against the backs of their necks. At some point, a man who had already paid and had a few drinks went outside for a smoke break since smoking was not allowed inside. There was still an extremely long line to get in, so he tried to re-enter through the exit door. The bouncer told him he could not do that and that he would need to wait in line and come back through the main entrance, though he would not have to pay again. The man became angry and tried to push past the bouncer, and eventually the bouncer forced him back out and locked the door. The man later went home, grabbed his girlfriend's gun, and returned to the bar, which I learned afterward from the owner in news coverage. He waited until someone exited through the door, slipped inside, and shot the bouncer in the back of the head multiple times. Because the bar was so crowded, chaos erupted instantly, with nearly everyone hitting the floor. Tables, food, drinks, keys, phones, and people were scattered everywhere, while others ran outside. My friends and I waited a few minutes until we believed it was safe, then we rushed out. At the time, we did not fully understand what had happened, and as we exited, we had to step over the bouncer's body to get out. I was lucky enough to find my phone and keys in the mess, though one of my friends never recovered his phone. The bar never truly recovered from the incident and closed for about a month before reopening, but it never regained the popularity it should have had after that night. Story 8. This happened while I was hanging out at my best friend's house, which faced the side of a popular bar in our town. That night, her husband was fairly intoxicated and had a fire pit burning out front, and they were also taking care of my guinea pigs along with theirs because I had moved somewhere that did not allow them. At one point, my boyfriend at the time and I went down to the basement to give treats to the guinea pigs, and through the open side door, we heard some commotion outside. We did not think much of it until I realized her husband could possibly be involved. So we ran outside and found him nowhere in sight, with the noise coming from two men across the street near the bar and another man in the parking lot arguing. We went back inside and found her husband in the basement, where he had gone to grab a beer and more cardboard for the fire pit, and the three of us started talking. A few minutes later, we heard what sounded like pop, 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 and instantly, we all knew those sounds were gunshots. We ran outside again just in time to see one of the men from across the street now in the parking lot, where the other man shot him 5 more times. The victim collapsed and the shooter stood over him and fired 3 additional shots before running up my best friend's street. The most heartbreaking part was hearing the victim's mother screaming as she was inside the bar at the time. We later learned the victim lived across the street and that his 2 young children witnessed their father bleeding out through a window. The killer was caught within an hour and admitted the argument was over $20 and a woman they were both trying to date, and he was charged with first-degree murder and 13 counts of wanton endangerment. Story 9. My friends and I were on a bus when the door opened and a man ran in, grabbed another man by the hair, and dragged him off the bus. Once outside, he slid his neck in one smooth motion, and it looked like a professional hit, though I cannot say for sure. We rushed to help him, but he died within seconds. Another time I was in Guatemala and saw a man riding a motorcycle in front of us when a car pulled up beside him and ran him off the road, sending him flying onto the rocks. My brother-in-law went to help, and when he came back, his clothes were covered in blood, and he said nothing. Later, speaking with the police and emergency responders as the rest of the drive passed in silence. The final time I was asleep at around 3 in the morning when I heard shouting and footsteps, so I went outside to check. My neighbor, who works in an emergency room, heard it too and was already helping a man who had been stabbed multiple times in the abdomen. I called 911 and applied pressure to one of the wounds until emergency medical services arrived and took him away. And afterward, I asked my neighbor if we had saved his life. He told me nothing was certain, but he did not think the man was going to survive. Story 10, I was with my cousin, his father, and my own father in Mexico in 2010, and at the time, my uncle and his soon-to-be ex-wife were not getting along at all. It was a Sunday and getting late, so we got into the car to drive my cousin to the next town. Because my uncle was not on good terms with his wife, we parked down the street near a corner store. As my uncle was saying goodbye to his son, a man wearing a hoodie, who we later learned was my aunt's brother, suddenly started chasing my uncle around the car with a knife. They ran 3 full laps around the vehicle before my father stepped out of the car with his 9mm Beretta and fired every round. My father was a hunter and an Army veteran and did not miss a single shot from the 14-round magazine, and the man was dead before he hit the ground. My father then fled the country, which was a terrible decision, but the firearm was unregistered. He was eventually arrested and brought back and served 2 years in prison for possession of an illegal firearm. That incident destroyed our family, but it has now been over a decade, and we have managed to get back on our feet. I rarely hear from my father anymore, but he still calls me from time to time. Story 11. A friend of mine came to visit from Florida for one night, and we went to an after-hours club. I had a fake identification card, but he was legally of age. We were outside smoking when a man pulled up in a white car, got out screaming, and walked toward the bouncer with a gun. The bouncer pulled out his own gun and shot him 6 times. It later came out that the bouncer had been sleeping with the man's wife. The man collapsed onto the hood of his white car, covered it in blood, and died there. The police arrived quickly, but a woman we had been talking to outside started loudly telling them that she and I had seen everything, and that the bouncer was not the shooter, claiming it was a drive-by. She was drunk and completely wrong. The police grabbed me, her, and my friend from Florida as witnesses to an alleged but false drive-by and took us downtown. I filled out all the paperwork using my fake identification, but eventually admitted I was underage and that the identification was fake once an officer began questioning it. He was angry, but let it go. We were kept downtown for 11 hours, repeatedly explaining that it was not a drive-by and that the bouncer was the shooter, which the police already knew. They gave us cheese sandwiches and let us smoke cigarettes at the station, but it was an exhausting, drunken, sleepless, and miserable night. My friend from Florida never came back to visit after that. Story 12. I am not sure if the man died, but I definitely witnessed an assault involving deadly force. I grew up in a rough town before transferring from community college, and one day I was outside the library when I saw an older man and a younger man clearly arguing. The older man was dressed in a smart, casual way, and I remember him wearing a brown sweater, red pants, leather shoes, and glasses, which I distinctly recall being knocked off his face. The younger man was less memorable, likely wearing whatever street fashion was popular at the time, and this was around 2015, so probably tight jeans, bright colors, and something with a cartoon character on it. I could not hear what the argument was about, and it could have been anything, but they were right in each other's faces, and I assumed the younger man had provoked it. Eventually they separated and walked off in opposite directions, getting about 20 feet apart before the older man turned back, approached from behind, and attacked. No one said anything as he struck the younger man on the side of the head, but the blow did not knock him down. The younger man ducked the second punch, countered, and a sloppy fight broke out as people began yelling for them to stop. The younger man was faster and eventually landed a solid punch that dropped the older man. What followed is what still haunts me. The younger man continued attacking, kicking the older man in the ribs and yelling, then stomping on his head. The first stomp produced no reaction, but the second caused the older man's arms and legs to spasm violently, and the third did the same. Only then did a friend of mine step forward and plead with the attacker to stop, which finally got his attention. And after shouting about unfair attacks, he stormed off through the crowd. I called the police, but they seemed uninterested now that the attacker was gone. No one present had medical training, and the older man was left lying there while people waited. Campus security arrived about 15 minutes later, and emergency services followed roughly 30 minutes after that. I was never contacted to give a statement, never saw a campus alert, and as far as I know, the attacker faced no consequences at all. Story 13. When I was 13, a friend and I stayed up all night practicing our best Britney Spears choreography when we heard noise outside. We peeked out the window and saw a man beating his pregnant girlfriend in their front yard. At the same time, we noticed a group of men jumping another man off to the side. One of them pulled out a gun and unloaded it into the man they were beating. They then shoved him into a car and drove away. The police later tried to get us to identify suspects in the case, but I could never be completely sure about any of the people they showed us. The second killing on that street happened about a year later. We were unloading groceries from our car one evening when two white men who had been loitering near the corner by our house suddenly ran into the street in front of a moving vehicle and fired multiple shots into the windshield. My mother ran into the house when she heard the gunfire, but I froze in place, unable to move. It all happened so fast. When I finally snapped out of it, I ran inside and saw my mother calling 911. When the police arrived, I saw one of the shooters speaking with them and flagged an officer down to tell him what I had witnessed. It turned out the men were undercover officers involved in a substance sting, and the man who was shot was killed without the officers identifying themselves to him or anyone else. Story 14. Tragically, I do not believe this qualifies as murder, although I feel that it should. The closest definition I could find was depraved heart manslaughter, but I could be wrong. The day before Halloween this year, I was stopped at a red light at a major intersection in my neighborhood with one car in front of me. When our light turned green, the car ahead of me began to slowly accelerate. Suddenly, from the left, a mid-sized sport utility vehicle barreled through its red light 3 to 4 seconds after it had changed. It clipped the front bumper off the car in front of me, the driver lost control, and the vehicle smashed directly into a grandmother waiting at a bus stop, killing her instantly. She had just picked up a pizza for her family and was on her way home. The driver's car tipped onto its side, and somehow he got out quickly enough to start yelling at the woman whose bumper he had destroyed, insisting it was her fault for being in the intersection on a green light. This was after she had collapsed out of her car, screaming in shock and disbelief that she had been involved. I was the first person to call 911, and when the operator asked if anyone could perform cardiopulmonary resuscitation, I remember telling her there was nothing left to perform it on. To my knowledge, the police ruled it an accident and nothing happened to the man. As one bystander said to me, "We had just witnessed that man make the worst mistake of his life, and I hope that moment never leaves him." Story 15. I have 3 experiences. The first was in the early 1990s. I was inside a convenience store playing a fighting game when I heard a loud pop followed by squealing tires. I assumed it was a car backfiring, but when I ran outside, I saw a man sitting on the sidewalk holding his stomach with blood pooling on the ground. A crowd started to gather, so I went back inside to watch from a safer place. A homeless man inside the store refused to leave because he was afraid the police would blame him simply for being there. I later found out from the news that the wounded man died. The second incident happened in the early 2000s, and I only heard it. I was on my computer late at night when I heard a series of popping sounds. My neighborhood was rough, and I was used to gunfire, so I stayed inside and avoided getting involved. The next morning, the house next door was swarming with police, and it turned out 3 college students had been murdered execution style overnight. I moved away not long after that. The last incident was also something I heard just a few months ago. I live next to a biker bar, and although it has been quieter due to the pandemic, one summer night I was just falling asleep when I heard motorcycles revving up and down the street, followed by a single unmistakable gunshot. I reported it to the police and went back to sleep. The next morning, my street was blocked off and there was a crashed motorcycle in the middle of the road. The body had already been removed, but there was still blood everywhere. I later learned there had been a bar fight and someone chased another biker down and shot him in front of my apartment complex. Story 16. Recently, back in 2019, I was riding a motorcycle with a group of 4 of us on a limited access expressway with 2 lanes. Traffic was moderate, moving around 50 to 55 miles per hour, even though the speed limit was 60. I will never forget it. A lifted red 2018 Ford F-150 decided to merge from the left lane into the right lane. He clearly looked behind him and saw me and the motorcycle in front of me, but he did not look directly to his right. He merged hard and fast, cutting us off and striking the motorcycle to his right, knocking him to the ground and killing him. The truck slammed on its brakes after the impact, and the rider in front of me crashed into the back of the pickup and was thrown into the truck bed. I managed to avoid the truck and pass in front of it, and 3 seconds later the lifted Ford was tapped by another Ford pickup, black, though I cannot remember the year, and it still hurts too much to even think about watching the camera footage. The lifted truck driver was furious that his new vehicle was damaged and started arguing with the other truck driver and the injured motorcyclist in his bed about who would pay for the damage, bragging that he was related to a lawyer and would sue for millions, completely ignoring the fact that he had just hit 2 motorcycles. We searched for our friend for what felt like forever, though it was probably only 2 minutes. And when we found him, he looked almost normal, no visible blood, and his helmet still intact. We did not touch him at first and were calling 911. He never responded, his pupils did not react to light, and when we ignored training advice and removed his jacket to check for a pulse, we saw an unbelievable amount of blood. I was not prepared for that. I knew then that he was dead, but I still tried to apply pressure even though it did nothing. I started screaming at the truck driver, at my friend for deciding to go on the ride, at my dead friend for dying, and at God for letting it happen. I blamed myself for convincing him to come. I gave up trying to help him and ran toward the expressway, wanting to be hit as well, and my friends had to physically restrain me and hold me down. I do not have health insurance, so I cannot afford therapy or counseling, and I still blame myself. I honestly do not really want to live, but I try to survive. The driver of the lifted truck had his citation dismissed because I was screaming that I killed my friend during the breakdown while my friends were restraining me. He never faced consequences. He was not intoxicated or distracted, just careless, and the system protected him. Paramedics restrained and sedated me and took me to the hospital by ambulance, and now I have medical debt because I make too much to qualify for assistance, but still struggle to pay rent. I have nightmares, panic, and lost my job because I could not ride anymore and could not afford a car. I lost my friend and eventually the others because I cannot talk about it. I stopped attending classes and now live in my girlfriend's apartment, sleeping on the sofa because I am afraid of getting too close. I did not start receiving food assistance until March. I am still fighting for medical coverage, and insurance will not help because I was not physically hit. I promised my girlfriend that when I can finally see a therapist, I will try to be normal again. I hope I can keep that promise. But I am still scared, and even now it all feels unbearably heavy. Story 17. My significant other and I lived on the top floor of a 12-story apartment building, and we got home around 11 in the evening after a movie. About 30 minutes later, we heard a domestic argument starting in the unit directly across the hall from ours, the door visible straight through our peephole. After a few minutes, the argument spilled into the hallway, and I got up to look through the peephole. The woman who lived there had her ex, the father of her son, show up because she was having problems with her current boyfriend, who lived with her, and the 2 men became physical. The boyfriend stabbed the father 3 times in the chest with a steak knife. I watched it all through the peephole, completely frozen in fear, and could only tell my boyfriend to call the police. He ran down the stairwell while I opened the door, and the injured father collapsed into our apartment, falling into my arms and lap. Paramedics arrived quickly and rushed him to the hospital, and police caught the boyfriend on the same block. I gave my statement still wearing the same clothes, which were covered in blood. I went to work the next morning because my supervisor showed no compassion and I was only 20 and did not know how to stand up for myself. The father survived, and later he thanked us for saving his life, and we went through the court process as key witnesses for about a year. As far as I know, the boyfriend is still in prison. This happened 11 years ago, and while I do not think about it often, when I do, I still feel awful for not opening the door sooner and trying to stop it. Story 18. When I was in high school and during my first years of college, my country was experiencing a horrifying wave of violence related to substance trafficking and organized crime, and my city was especially affected. Because of this, I witnessed two murders, both while traveling to college. The first time, I was on a bus heading to the subway and saw several soldiers outside a convenience store. Seeing soldiers in the streets was very common back then, so it did not alarm me. There was a military truck parked there, and underneath it I could see the legs of a man lying on the ground. In my 17-year-old mind, I assumed he was a homeless man sleeping in the parking lot. Then a soldier walked up to him, pointed his weapon, and shot him. I did not see the entire scene, but I saw the moment the soldier fired and how the man's legs moved slightly as blood spread across the ground before he stopped moving completely. Hours later, I saw on the news that the man had been an extortionist. The second incident was far worse. Once again, I was heading to college and passed under a large vehicle bridge, something completely ordinary. That day, however, a man was hanging by the neck from the highest point of the bridge, suspended by a chain. Next to him was a large banner with a threatening message from a substance trafficking group directed at their enemies. I do not know if the man was already dead and the movement came from the wind, but the sight was deeply shocking. I needed therapy for a long time afterward to be able to cope with what I had seen. Story 19. Around 5 to 6 years ago, I was returning home from church at around 7 or 8 in the evening, when it gets dark very quickly where I live. I suddenly heard a pair of screams coming from a nearby street that is usually very calm, even at night. At that time, I was a reckless teenager who practiced martial arts and believed I could handle dangerous situations, so I ran toward the street where the screams came from to see what was happening. What I saw was a middle-aged man sitting on a motorcycle, holding a gun, and shooting an elderly woman twice. As he picked up what I now believe was her purse from the ground, I ran away as fast as I could and returned to the street that led back to my home. When I finally arrived, I did not tell my mother what I had seen, and I did not call the police either. I realized afterward how foolish that was, but I chose to keep it as a dark lesson about life. Although this was not the only murder I have witnessed, it was the first and the most disturbing because of my age at the time and the circumstances surrounding it. Story 20. I was a freshman at my current high school, and I am a senior now, but I will never forget that day. It was Valentine's Day, and from the start something felt off. The fire alarm went off during my second period English class, but it was only a drill. Later in the day, with about 45 minutes left before we could go home, the fire alarm went off again. We were confused but followed procedure. I was on the third floor, so we started going down the stairs, but suddenly everyone turned around and ran back up. That was when I heard the gunshots. I turned and ran back toward my classroom. The teacher was trying to unlock the door, which automatically locks when closed. And as I looked behind me, I saw the shooter firing in my direction. The door finally opened, and I ran inside and hid. The shooter kept firing, and I could hear screaming outside the door. The air smelled like gunpowder and iron from the blood. We waited for the police for what felt like hours, though it was probably only around 30 minutes. And the entire time we could hear someone outside screaming for help, but there was nothing we could do. When we were finally rescued, we were lined up with our hands on our heads and escorted out of the building. There was blood all over the floors and walls, and bodies on the staircases and in the hallways. 17 people died that day, and I will never forget any part of it. Story 21. The night before my family and I were supposed to move, we were all sitting in our living room with the lights off because there was no power or air conditioning. We were sitting by the window, which was wide open with no curtain or screen. But since the lights were off, no one outside could see the four of us sitting there. Suddenly, a car drove up and stopped in the middle of the street, and moments later, gunfire erupted. It lasted for several minutes. My brother and I were the only ones who did not drop to the floor, and we watched as the people in the car fired round after round into a nearby house. When the car finally left, everything was silent for about 5 minutes before sirens filled the air. An ambulance arrived, and after some time they brought out my neighbor, the mother of two of my friends, on a stretcher. We could hear her talking, so we assumed she was going to be okay, but a few hours later her oldest daughter was on the phone, screaming and crying, because the hospital had told her that her mother had not survived. We moved out of that neighborhood within a week. I still think about how kind she was, and how I was friends with her children, and how she did not deserve to die that night. Story 22. I was walking down the 16th Street Mall in Denver when I saw a homeless-looking person pushing another homeless-looking person in a wheelchair. They bumped into an older man, maybe around 60 years old, and he said something like, telling them to watch where they were going. The man pushing the wheelchair snapped back, and the older man insulted him. The younger man punched him once in the face, and he was knocked out instantly, falling straight down like a tree being cut. His head hit the pavement first before the rest of his body, and the impact was catastrophic. Blood came from his ear in short bursts and then stopped. The younger man ran off, still pushing the wheelchair. A police officer arrived moments later while I stood there in shock. I described the attacker and pointed in the direction he ran. The officer returned shortly after and had me identify the man, then left again. About 10 minutes passed with the body still lying there before an ambulance arrived, loaded him up, and drove away without lights or sirens, which made it clear he had died. I sat on a bench trying to process it all. A shopkeeper then came out with a hose and washed the blood off the sidewalk as if it were routine. Minutes later, a family walked by over the still wet pavement, completely unaware of what had just happened. The whole thing felt unreal. Story 23. I am probably late to tell this, but I have seen one murder in my life, and it is something I still struggle to put into words. I was 17 years old, a high school senior, partying a lot and spending time with some older friends. One of them was Avi, who was genuinely kind, outgoing, and always trying to bring people together. One night we went to a party at a girl's house just outside of town, near the woods. It was awkward in the usual way, but still enjoyable. At some point I noticed a strange man with small cuts on his face that looked intentional, not accidental, and he made everyone uncomfortable. He also had a large knife openly hanging from his belt. It turned out he was an old friend of Avi's from middle school, someone Avi had run into earlier that day and invited along. Despite the uneasy feeling, the night continued. Around midnight, Avi went outside to get something from his car. I was on the porch talking to a girl when I suddenly heard a horrible scream. I ran toward it and saw Avi on the ground in the dimly lit gravel driveway, with the man standing over him holding the knife. He had stabbed Avi 5 times. I ran to Avi and focused only on trying to find the wounds and stop the bleeding, even though the attacker was still right there. I remember pressing on the wounds, one near his armpit, one on his neck, and another on his abdomen, but it was useless. Avi died in my arms, and it was not peaceful. I will never forget the sounds, the blood, or the smell. Later I learned the attacker had some kind of psychotic episode and believed Avi was something else entirely. I do not know what happened to him afterward. Writing about it is still hard, but it feels necessary. Story 24. I worked in a trauma center for years, so I never saw the murders themselves, only the aftermath. We often learn details from talking to police or reading reports the next day. Most of the time, unless a long period had passed, even people who were supposedly dead were brought in with cardiopulmonary resuscitation, still in progress. It was always shocking how random the lethality of knives and gunshots could be. I saw people shot straight through the head from front to back who walked out of the hospital a week later. I saw people stabbed 24 times with a kitchen knife who did not suffer a single life-threatening injury, even when the abdominal cavity was penetrated. I saw someone's neck cut clean across the front, deep enough to sever all the neck muscles, yet missing every major artery and vein. Then there were others who were stabbed once with a small knife and died. One case that always stayed with me was a stab to the inside of the arm that hit the radial artery, and no one around him knew how to apply pressure, so he bled out. People often think a small caliber round is not dangerous, and sometimes I saw skulls stop them. But I also saw those same rounds penetrate the heart or aorta and kill someone instantly. One of the least lethal places to be shot or stabbed is the left lower side of the chest or abdomen where the spleen sits. Usually a chest tube, removal of the spleen, and maybe some stitches or staples to the stomach or a small section of colon. I always felt some relief when injuries were in that area. The other side, where the liver and major veins are, was a very different story. Story 25. When I was 5 years old, I was with my family in a crowd of people on the 4th of July, gathered just before a service at a Korean church in our town. Everyone was laughing, there was food, and music was planned for later in the day. Suddenly, I thought someone had set off firecrackers and I covered my ears. But almost immediately, people started screaming. A man was on the ground, and one of my mother's closest friends was kneeling over him, pressing her hands to his stomach and screaming for help. I never saw his face. My mother grabbed us kids, ran to the car, and made my brother and me duck down on the floor. There was yelling and chaos, but my memory after that is fragmented until we got home. That night we went to Bible study, and most of the people there were from the church where it happened. Everyone was in shock, crying, not knowing why it had happened, only that a good man was gone for no reason. His parents flew in shortly after, and even though I was so young, I will never forget the looks on their faces. There was a memorial at the church, and they stood crying over the exact spot where he had been shot. Later we learned it was a racially motivated drive-by carried out by an extremist, firing indiscriminately into the crowd and killing a Korean graduate student. There were multiple victims across several locations that day. That experience permanently changed how I saw the world. I was white, and it was my first real understanding of racism as something immediate and deadly, not just something from history books. Someone my family knew was dead solely because of who he was, and that realization never left me. Story 26. This was more manslaughter than anything else, but it still haunts me. My father and I had just pulled into our driveway after dinner when we heard a loud bang up the street. Somehow my dad immediately knew it was a car accident and told me to get back in the car so we could see if anyone was hurt. We were the second ones to arrive, the first being some kids on a go-kart who had actually witnessed the crash. The car was completely mangled and flipped over, and we could hear someone screaming inside. We tried to open the doors but could not get any of them to budge. My father, who was very strong, actually ripped the passenger side door handle completely off, and then suddenly the door swung open on its own, which is still one of the strangest things I have ever seen. We helped the person in the passenger area get out. His leg was clearly broken in half and he was in complete shock. We thought he was the only person in the vehicle until paramedics arrived very quickly and shined a light into the back seat. That is when we saw the mangled body of another person behind the front passenger seat, who was very clearly dead. We learned later that the man we helped was actually the driver, and the person who died had originally been the passenger. They had been thrown around inside the car because the driver was going 75 miles per hour in a 35-mile-per-hour zone, hit a tree, and flipped multiple times. The driver was intoxicated on alcohol and pills. I will never forget the condition of that body when the paramedics' flashlights illuminated the back seat, and my father and I both knew instantly that he was gone. That image has stayed with me ever since. Story 27. I worked at a nightclub in Baltimore around 2010 to 2011, and fights were common enough that we had roaming security staff to deal with them, while Dr. Security focused on checking identification, securing exits, and making sure drinks stayed inside. Because of that, it was normal to see bouncers suddenly sprinting through packed rooms or up staircases to handle problems elsewhere. One night I was behind the bar, and it was completely slammed, serving drinks to what felt like thousands of people, when I noticed every single security guard rushing toward the area near the restrooms. Even the door staff abandoned their posts, which immediately told me something was wrong. I decided to check it out and took one of the barback shortcuts, slipping out from under the DJ stage near the front of the security line. Every guard had frozen in place, and about 10 meters ahead of us was a man who had had his throat slashed and was drowning in his own blood. It looked like he had been attacked and then tried to run for the back door before collapsing. I have never seen so much blood in my life. The entire hallway was coated in a long trail of it, splashed across the walls where he had flailed in panic, trying to stay alive for even a few more seconds. Later we learned he had been involved in robbing substance dealers. 3 people were arrested and later released, The weapon was never found, and no one was ever charged. The venue eventually closed, and now the building is used as a wedding and event space, and I sometimes think about how people celebrate there without knowing what happened inside those walls. Story 28. In the 1990s, I witnessed something that still terrifies me. I was at a gas station when a motorcycle police officer was arguing with an older man who was pumping gas into his pickup truck. The man kept yelling that he was just getting gas for work and did not understand why the officer was bothering him, while the officer demanded that he hand over his identification immediately. The man finished pumping gas and got into his truck, but the officer blocked the door so he could not close it. The man started the engine and put the truck into drive, making jerking movements and shouting that the officer was going to make him late for work. The officer then pulled his gun, pressed it point blank into the man's abdomen, and fired. The man slumped over the steering wheel as the truck rolled forward slowly and came to a stop in the street. Several of us at the gas station saw everything. When I got home, the story was already all over the news, framed as a justified shooting, claiming the man had assaulted the officer and tried to run him over. The man was a father of 3 and a church deacon, and his family struggled without him as their sole provider. Churches held fundraisers to help them survive, while the officer was suspended with pay for a few months and then returned to his life. I have always wondered if anything would have been different if I had spoken up more forcefully. Story 29. I have seen far too much violence in my life. When I was 8 years old, I was in a convenience store when it was robbed. A city inspector walked in at the exact moment it happened, and the robber shot him almost point blank. The clerk called an ambulance, and I ran home without telling anyone. When I was 12, I was homeless and living in recycling dumpsters behind office buildings. One morning, I woke up to screaming and saw one homeless man attacking another, repeatedly stabbing him. It went on for several minutes before the attacker calmly walked away, and the body was found almost immediately. When I was 15, drifting between the streets and temporary places to stay, I walked into a house and found someone who had cut their wrists in a bathtub. I called emergency services, but they were already cold to the touch. When I was 17, I was in Indonesia when a man was shot in the head in broad daylight in a crowded market. Everyone ran, police arrived within minutes, and then life continued as if nothing had happened. Later in life, I held my grandmother's hand in hospice for 9 hours until she passed away. And even after she was declared dead, I stayed with her and read to her because I did not want her to be alone. I have also seen a cyclist crushed under a truck, a man killed during a tribal conflict, and another person set on fire in a gang-related attack. I live with severe depression and bipolar disorder, and while I have a career, a family, and a life that looks normal from the outside, these memories still surface, and there is a darkness I rarely share with anyone, even after years of therapy trying to quiet it. Story 30. It was an attempted murder, and the police officer survived, but about 15 to 20 years ago, my friend and I were standing across the street from the boardwalk, a small beachside amusement park in my hometown. Suddenly, we heard a series of loud bangs coming from a nearby neighborhood that had a reputation for substances and gang activity. We could tell immediately it was gunfire and not fireworks because there were clearly 2 different calibers. About a minute later, a police cruiser came speeding toward us from the direction of the shots, driving the wrong way down a one-way street, and swerved to a stop near the bumper car ride directly across from us. The driver jumped out, ran to the passenger side, grabbed his partner under the arms, and dragged him out onto the pavement. Other people ran over, and when his shirt was cut away, we could see a massive blood stain on his white undershirt beneath the vest. We later learned the bullet had just missed his body armor and struck one of his lungs. My friend and I stood there frozen, mouths open, until sirens filled the air. The police station was less than half a mile away, and I have never seen so many police cars outside of a riot. They flooded the area, shut down the bridge and the railroad trestle over the river, and searched every vehicle as people tried to leave. We watched the wounded officer rush past in an ambulance while paramedics worked frantically on him. The rumor at the time was that the 2 officers had encountered a parolee shooting substances in a phone booth, and instead of being arrested again, he opened fire, hitting one of them. I do not remember exactly what happened to the suspect, but I believe he was later found and killed. It was surreal to witness, especially in a town where violent crime is rare and usually overshadowed by petty theft. Story 31. This was not intentional murder, but it resulted in the deaths of 3 people. I lived 2 doors down from a house that always seemed to have trouble surrounding it. A few years ago, a young mother of 4 was beaten to death by her boyfriend, who hid her body in an upstairs closet for days while he partied, then buried her in a shallow grave near the train tracks across from my house. He was eventually arrested and charged. Not long after, a substance dealer moved in and was quickly raided, and then a new family arrived, a mother, father, and 3 children. Their 2 older boys, around 3 and 4 years old, were often outside barefoot and in diapers no matter the weather. One night, the father was arrested and taken to jail. The very next day, while I was at work, my husband called me in tears. The mother had recently given birth to twins and was sleeping on the couch while the 9-year-old daughter was downstairs. The oldest boy took his younger brother upstairs, found a cigarette lighter, and accidentally started a fire in the bedroom. Neighbors heard the boys screaming and alerted the mother when they saw smoke coming from the window. She managed to get the 9-year-old and the newborn twins outside before running back into the house. When she did not return, several neighbors who had called 911 rushed inside but could not break through the bedroom door. The screaming stopped and flames began pouring out of the window, forcing them to retreat. Firefighters eventually broke down the door and extinguished the fire, only to find the mother holding both boys, all 3 having died from smoke inhalation. A mattress had become wedged against the door, trapping them inside. My husband was among those who tried to help and was interviewed for the news. He watched all 3 bodies being carried out and still becomes emotional talking about it. The second floor of the house was later demolished, and it has since been rebuilt as a single-story home, now occupied by a loving family. Story 32. This was not something I directly witnessed, but it happened very close to where I live, and it has been weighing on me heavily for weeks. I live in a trailer home park in an area known for constant trouble. About 3 weeks ago, over the weekend, I was home playing video games when I heard gunshots. I did not think much of it at first because several people in the area own handguns, including teenagers, but it still scared me badly. Shortly after, I heard a car speeding away at full force, and the whole situation felt off, though I tried to ignore it. The next day on Sunday, there was breaking news about a body being found in the desert near the trailer park. At first, no details were released, but people in the comments who lived nearby mentioned hearing gunshots the night before. The following day, things became much more real when the body was identified as a student who went to my high school and was supposed to graduate this year. That Tuesday, police announced they had found a suspect. A friend shared the article online, and when I saw the suspect's face, my stomach dropped because he looked like someone I knew. I clicked the article hoping I was wrong, but it turned out to be my best friend from high school. I completely broke down and nearly passed out. He was the person who accepted me for who I was, protected me when I was a freshman and he was a junior, defended me from bullies, supported my performances, and always greeted me with warmth. I could not believe he was involved in something so terrible that would destroy his life forever. Later, a second suspect was arrested, someone I did not know well but had always seemed suspicious, with social media full of substances and obscene behavior. At first, he was described as the victim's friend who had been assaulted after the killing, but he was later arrested as well after trying to flee. I am not defending my friend, as it later came out that both suspects were intoxicated and are now blaming each other for the murder. Still, knowing that someone who meant so much to me is involved in something so horrific has been incredibly difficult, and I am still trying to cope and keep my mind from spiraling. Story 33. I was at a party with a lot of underage drinking, but overall it was a familiar group of people. At some point, uninvited guests showed up with the clear intention of causing trouble. My best friend went downstairs to ask them to leave because the homeowner was too scared to confront them herself. I followed a few moments later and witnessed my childhood babysitter stab my best friend in the chest. Everything after that is fragmented and blurry. I remember running nonstop, completely panicked, to a mutual friend's house and calling my boyfriend at the time, who told me not to contact him because he did not want to be involved with the police. I spent the rest of the night at the police station giving statements and trying to comfort friends. I went home, slept for maybe an hour or two, And when I woke up, I learned through a social media post that my best friend had died on the way to the hospital. The pain was indescribable. Someone I loved deeply was gone, killed by someone who had been part of my childhood. My parents were close with the killer's family, and my father had helped raise her sister. I remember opening my parents' door and collapsing on the floor, and the months that followed feel almost non-existent in my memory. Testifying in court was a nightmare I would not wish on anyone. The only light I can find is that my current partner and I grew close while supporting each other through the grief, and we will have been together for 10 years this September. That is the only silver lining I can hold on to, and I am endlessly grateful to have him in my life. Story 34. One of my close football friends was killed during his senior year of high school, and I will call him Dave. We were all out drinking one night at one of our friends' clubhouses, a huge gathering with around 150 high school kids, most of us tipsy and playing in a massive beer pong tournament. It was around 12:30 at night and things were starting to slow down, but Dave had been involved in an argument earlier with another person at the party. A lot of us thought the situation had settled and that we would all be heading home soon, but that was not the case. After most people had left, Dave and a few of us were standing in a small circle in front of someone's car, just talking. Dave was leaning against the hood with his hands in his pockets when suddenly the person he had argued with earlier came up from behind us, pushed through the group, and stood directly in front of Dave. He said some extremely hateful things and, without any warning, punched Dave upward under the chin. Dave went completely limp. The person who hit him panicked, jumped into a friend's car and sped off. We tried everything we could, tapping him, trying to wake him, and one of our friends who was a nurse checked him. But after about 10 minutes, we rushed him to the hospital around 1 in the morning. I helped carry Dave to the car, though I did not go to the hospital myself. The next morning, I woke up to the news that Dave had died. The punch had caused damage that severed an artery near his spine, and doctors said he likely died within 2 minutes of impact. The person who hit him was only 17 at the time, and his punishment was that he could not stay out past 7 in the evening until he turned 21. It felt like nothing compared to what was lost. Dave's family would not have even pressed charges if the person had shown remorse, but in court I saw no emotion at all. It has been nearly 4 years without him, and I still think about him almost every day. He was one of my brothers in uniform. Story 35. This was not exactly murder, more like attempted murder that ended in self-defense. A few years ago, my boyfriend and I were driving home during light rush hour traffic when we noticed 2 cars aggressively weaving in and out of lanes on a 4-lane road. They were cutting each other off, slamming on brakes, honking and yelling, clearly escalating a road rage situation. At first, we were several cars behind them, but by the time we reached a red light, we were directly behind one of the cars, with the other stopped in front of it. I had just told my boyfriend that we should let them get farther ahead because I was afraid they would cause an accident, when the light turned green and the man in the front car suddenly got out and started walking toward the other car. The driver of the car in front of us opened his door partway, with 1 foot inside and 1 foot on the road, and I then saw he had a gun pointed at the approaching man. My boyfriend yelled for me to get down and said both men had guns, but everything happened so fast that there were already 2 flashes and loud pops. The man who had approached staggered backward, made it halfway into his car, and slumped over. Cars sped away in panic, and the shooter drove off into a nearby apartment complex. We could tell the man who was shot was badly injured. My boyfriend told me to stay in the car, then went to check on him with another witness. He waved me over, and we pulled the man out of the car and laid him on the road. My boyfriend used his shirt to support the man's head, and I asked if anyone knew cardiopulmonary resuscitation. I was a dental hygienist at the time and was trained, but I had never performed it on a real person. No one else stepped forward, so I started compressions, even though it felt hopeless. By chance, 2 off-duty paramedics were nearby and rushed over, taking over care until the ambulance arrived. The man had no pulse and had been shot in the chest and upper abdomen, and I knew he was already gone. Later, the other man returned and tried to surrender, shouting for police from across the street. At first, officers thought he was just a witness, but eventually it became clear he was the other shooter, and he was arrested after revealing where he had hidden his weapon. We stayed at the scene for over 6 hours because our car was part of the crime scene. In the end, the shooter was not charged, as it was ruled self-defense since the other man had exited his car in advance while armed. The entire experience was deeply unsettling. I had nightmares for months afterward, and I no longer react aggressively on the road.